My name is Nick Floyd. I have a long history with Magic the Gathering. I created the Dan Dan variant. Now I'm creating this. Welcome to Magic Storytime. This is Episode 10, U.S. Nationals, Columbus, Ohio, July 1997. Chronologically, my next story should be Mountain Regionals, Denver, Colorado, 1997, and how I qualified for Nationals that year. But it is one of my best Magic stories, so I told it as my first story on this channel. If you haven't heard the story, please watch the Intimidator, link in the description. That story also has a parallel to my Nationals story presented here. Nationals that year was in Columbus, Ohio, as part of Origin's Game Fair that year. I arrived in Columbus the day before the tournament began. I was 18 years old, but had never traveled outside of Wyoming by myself, so my dad came with me. Man, I miss him. He must have been bored out of his mind all weekend, but he said he enjoyed watching me do well in the Magic tournament. Also, one of my teammates, the Bad Boys of Bowden, came on a separate flight a day earlier. We were splitting a hotel room a short way from the convention center. Previously mentioned my friend Ivan. Anecdote number 2. Anyway, Ivan came to Origin to play in what was known as the Meat Grinders, which were Type 2 qualifiers for Nationals the day before Nationals started. To be honest, I think Ivan and the core of the Bad Boys, though they didn't come to Regionals to try and qualify for Nationals, were a bit jealous that I had made it to Nationals, and Ivan came to show that my presence was just a bit of a fluke, and I wasn't the best Magic player in Rock Springs. By the end of the weekend, Ivan said something to me close to, "I knew you were good at Magic, but you are really good," he said. I'd be watching behind, where I could see your hand and thinking, "Nick, you've got to do this, you've got to do this." But you wouldn't do that. You'd do something completely different, and it was better than I would have done. He seemed surprised, but I was very happy to have Ivan there. His experience in the Meat Grinders gave him the expertise to build the deck that I played in the Type 2 portion of the tournament, and he had unknowingly brought a full playset of the card I needed to make it work. Along the same lines, a tournament grinder friend we had known from Salt Lake by the name of Jack was there at Nationals, and had also watched me play. Jack was well known in the Salt Lake area, and played in a couple of pro tournaments at the time, and the Bad Boys respected him a great deal. Sometime on day 2, Jack sought Ivan and I out, and took us aside at lunch. Jack said that he had watched me play, and he was impressed. He said that he thought I had what it takes to play on the Pro Tour. Wow, if Ivan and Jack were impressed by my play, and thought that I could play at a higher level, maybe I should set that as a goal. More on that later. Day 1 was Mirage Block Rochester Draft. If you don't know what Rochester Draft is, it is a booster draft, but instead of opening a booster and drafting a card and passing the rest of the pack unseen by the other players, a member of the tournament judging crew opens the booster and lays all the cards face up on the table, and then players take turns drafting a card from the face-up cards on the table. There's some additional minor rules, but that's the basics. It allows the players to see what everyone drafted. It's really an interesting way to draft Magic. I recommend you try it sometime. It was Mirage Block, so we would draft the Mirage packs first, then Visions, then Weatherlight. 1 pack of each for each of the 8 drafters. As you may know, in big limited tournaments, the packs are opened ahead of time and stamped on the front, so players can't easily cheat by adding cards to their decks. I still have all the cards I drafted that day. There was a draft followed by 3 rounds of Swiss with the players you drafted with. Then there would be another draft with players of the same record and another set of Swiss rounds. I had done 1 practice Rochester draft with my play group, knew I wanted to draft blue, black, white, and thought I was ready. I hadn't practiced enough to realize a few important points about draft. 1, an even 3-color split makes land and mana hard to manage. You are likely to get color screwed. A splash of 1 color is better. 2, you should not go in expecting to force a particular color or combination of colors. Instead, draft the deck that comes to you. Draft the colors that are open. And 3, practice more than once with the best players possible. My 1 practice draft with my community college play group wasn't enough. I should have practiced with my team, the Bad Boys, Ivan, the Twins, and those guys. They were the best players in town and could have helped me prepare better. So anyway, I drafted blue, white, and black pretty evenly, and built my deck with a pretty even split. Looking at the cards I drafted, I should have just splashed white, but I didn't. I won my first match and lost my second and third by getting color screwed in one of my three colors, leaving a third of my deck completely unplayable. I was really depressed about my two losses going into the second draft and hadn't really learned the lessons I needed to. I was still set on drafting blue, black, white. I remember leaning heavily on the tables as the draft began and just apathetic about the whole thing. But as I drafted the best blue, black, and white cards during the Mirage packs, I noticed I was the only drafter really taking white cards. I got two pacifisms in Mirage packs, a key removal spell. As the Mirage packs were drafted and I realized my white was so good, the cloud that was over me began to lift. Visions was very good to be in blue, and the Weatherlight packs were kind of a balance between white and blue, filling in the gaps. I barely drafted any black cards at all, but didn't feel like I was missing anything, and had a large amount of flyers. Put together a blue-white deck that I was really pleased with, and had regained my total confidence. Your first opponent in the Swiss rounds following the draft would be known based on where you were sitting during the draft. But as I sat down to play my first opponent, he said, "You were the one drafter I didn't want to play against." That made me feel even more confident. I mean, all my opponents had seen what I had drafted, and my first opponent knew it was good. To his credit, he did beat me one of our 3 games. My next 2 opponents were not so lucky, but I swept the next 2 rounds. I ended the draft portion of Nationals 4-2. After day 1 of Nationals, I still didn't have a deck for the Type 2 standard portion the following day. That evening, I had no idea what I would be playing. What was I going to play? Ivan and I went to our hotel to figure out what the hell I was going to play. We tried a bunch of different things, nothing was working. Whatever Ivan played against me was beating me. We would switch decks and he would win again. Nothing was working for me. I wasn't feeling it and it was getting late. My advice, don't do this. I do it again in the Magic story for another time. But don't do what I did. Find your deck and practice beforehand. Ivan had played in the Meat Grinders the day before, and he had some info about the meta. He told me about his experience and about abeyance. Since Weatherlight had been released, we had not noticed this broken rare. It had been printed with bad wording and had not been ruled or eroded correct to not affect mana ability. So it shut down the tapping glands for mana. It was basically a time walk if cast during your opponent's upkeep, and they had no responses and no attack. It had totally gone unnoticed by the bad boys, but Ivan had been seeing it played in Counterpost deck. Counterpost was a blue-white control deck that used Jorn Outpost as its win count, a full contingent of counterspells, and 4 copies of Abeyance. Like I said, nobody paid attention to Abeyance. We considered it a junk rare. I had none. Earlier in the weekend when Ivan told me about Abeyance and how broken it was, he leaned over to me and whispered, "I checked our binders. We have 4. These were the binders that he had brought with him from some of the other bad boys so that Ivan could build decks for the Meat Grinders. As late as it was, we had time to build one more deck. Ivan said, "Let me build you Counterpost." Okay, I said. Ivan didn't know a complete deck list, but he had seen the deck. He knew that future Hall of Fame player John Finkel was running a version with Brainstorm and Impulse called Finkel Post. Well, we couldn't find what to cut for playsets of those cards, so they were left out, and that was significant to one of my wins, which I will get to. I know I had some input into the deck and sideboard. Anyway, Ivan and I played one game in which I played Counterpost. I don't remember what Ivan played, but I remember I lost to whatever it was. But it was late and I said to Ivan, "This is what I'm playing. I know how to play it. I need to get some sleep. And that's it." Only a few hours before my standard Nationals event, and I had finally had a deck. Was it going to be like the first draft today? Nope. More like the second draft. I won, and I just kept winning. In the 4th or 5th round, I faced another Counterpost deck, a mirror match. This would be a test of control skill. Yeah, this might go to time. I don't remember my opponent's name, but I do remember that he came off as close to my age, around 18, within a year or 2 either side. It became obvious from the start that he was running the Finkel Post version of the deck, with Brainstorms and Impulse. The Counterpost decks at the time ran a single copy of So Debbie Digger, to put cards back into the library and avoid decking. Mine was no exception. I assumed his wasn't either. We both got a pair of Killjoy outposts and were blocking each other's soldier tokens, and neither of us was making any headway. At one point, I tried to play my Soldevi Digger, but my opponent countered it or disenchanted it. So I'm looking at this stalemate and thinking, he still has a Soldevi Digger in his deck and mine is gone. He's running Brainstorm and Impulse, so he will have fewer cards in his library overall. All I have to do is kill his Digger when it shows up, and he'll deck out first. So I started collecting the right cards. I know there will be a counter war, so that's important. And then I also need Disenchant to kill it if I lose the counter battle. So I had a pair of Disenchant and a bunch of counter spells when he tried to play his Digger. He did win the counter war, and the Digger made it to play, but he couldn't counter the Disenchant once I untapped. Knowing he had fewer cards in his deck, and the board was a stall, he conceded the first game to try and win the next two. We sideboarded and began game 2. I had sideboarded out all 3 of my Killjoy outposts, my only win con, because I expected he sideboarded in Political Trickery, which is what I sideboarded. That and I think Helm of Obedience to help me mill if that was an option again. Pretty sure he wouldn't have any creatures to hit. During the game, he played Killjoy outposts pretty early. Good, because my Political Trickeries necessitated him still playing them after sideboarding. The soldier tokens did some damage. I Wrath God and kept their numbers small. It kind of looked like I was struggling, which was important because at one point, I cast an Abeyance during my own main phase and shrugged my shoulders with a look on my face. Like I was just trying to draw a card off the cantrip, and made sure he was okay to let it resolve. Then I revealed what I was actually doing. With the Abeyance shielding me from counterspells, I activated my Thine Glaciers and cast Political Trickery, trading my Glaciers, which would return to my hand at the end of the turn, for his Killjoy outpost. Oh, he didn't take that well. It was indeed trickery, and he hadn't seen it coming. One of the best bluffs of my Magic career. But the tables had turned, and my own soldier tokens from his stolen outpost started to even things out. He eventually got a second outpost, and the game became a stalemate again. But I knew all I had to do was run out the clock to get the match win. I didn't stall or anything, but 2 slow control decks were just like 2 walls pushing against each other. It was a well-played match, but my strategies both games won me the match. My second to last match was against a player by the name of Kyle Bigos. Kyle had brought a 4-colored black deck to Nationals, which had a bunch of knights in it. They take on the 12 knight deck. But unlike regionals, I was ill prepared for a heavy knight deck and didn't put Knights of the Mist in my sideboard. Kyle was obviously a very good player to play at the level we were playing at. I guess since we were both playing for top 8 spots, Wizards was going to record our match. The cameras came out, and I had to play part of the match with a camera on the table pointed at me. I don't remember being really intimidated or distracted by the cameras, but I definitely remember them being there. Our games were somewhat similar to my games against the 12 knight deck at Mountain Regional, but I could not hold out this time. In our last game, he got me down to 1 life before casting Kervik's Spite while I was tapped out. I had Force Will in my hand too, just like a regional, but this time I had 1 life instead of 2. I remember congratulating Kyle on the win, showing him the Force of Will, pointing out I didn't have the life to cast it, and told him my regional's opponent did it when I was at 2 life. He said he wouldn't have risked it if I had 2 life. Anyway, Kyle was cool, legitimately beaten. I figured I'd be rooting for him in the finals if I didn't make it. My last match was against Justin Gary. Justin has since become a game designer, entrepreneur, and hosted the Think Like a Gamer podcast and website, link in the description. At USNationalsJuly1997, Justin was playing a fairly unique counter burn deck, some aggressive and hard-to-kill creatures, curated for the meta. Frenetic Efreet, Rainbow Efreet, and Wildfire Emissary. He was also running 4 Mana War and Earthquake. His was a great deck to give fits to counterpost, Black Knights, and anything else in the meta. We only went 2 games, but they were both tough games. The first game went long as we were both playing a version of Control. For the second game, I figured his deck was slow, Control, and I had not seen many creatures, so I went into the mill mode, boarding in my Helms of Obedience. The second game was also a Control Mirror Slog. I did late in the game get a Helm of Obedience in play, but it hit a Wildfire Emissary, which I hadn't yet seen. Anyway, because he had won the first game, he got the match win. I figured I'd be rooting for Justin and Kyle in the next day's finals. After my Nationals bid had run its ground, I played the Dan deck with Ivan. We must have played 30 games that weekend, both at empty tables in the convention halls and in the hotel room. We probably played Dan late that night because we didn't wake the next day in time to watch the final 8. By the time we made it to the convention hall the next day, the final match was taking place. The 2 players playing were Kyle Bigos and Justin Gary. My 2 losses in the Type 2 portion of the weekend. 2 players I said I would be rooting for. No matter who ended up on top, the winner and the runner-up of US Nationals was going to be the 2 players who had beaten me and put me out of the tournament. That felt pretty good. Justin Gary ended up defeating Kyle Bigos, and Justin became the 1997 US National Champion. Later I found out my overall standing in the tournament was 18 out of 180 invitees. Not bad for my first big tournament. It ended up being my only big Magic, as college was the path my life was on. But I could play Magic in college and who knows, maybe make the pros. But that's a Magic story for another time. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. See you next time on Magic Storytime.